Welcome back, and today we have another week of Broadway grosses, and honestly, as you know, most shows tend to fall big after a huge holiday, but this was not so bad, so let's get into it. And Juliet went from 100% last week to 91.31% capacity this week, and 1,459,276 last week to this week's 1,138,118 for a $321,000 drop, which is not terrible. For most big musicals, this is where they typically tend to fall in the $200,000 to $300,000 range, so there's nothing to be too concerned about there. And if you look at before Thanksgiving, this number is pretty consistent with how they've been doing since before Thanksgiving. A Beautiful Noise went from 56% to 78%, and 759K to 1,138,980. Now, this is incredibly irregular that a musical does very bad on Thanksgiving, but then the next week does amazing. Back to the Future. A Beautiful Noise continues to surprise and shock me. And I think as long as it continues to do this, I don't think it's going to close anytime soon. You know, I mean, obviously they're not the best-selling show, but when they hit big, they hit big. So I don't think it's going to close immediately. It's just very weird how, you know, in the summer they don't do good, but then in the fall they do better. It doesn't follow the patterns that most musicals follow in terms of business. And it's very interesting. Back to the Future went from 97% to 84%, and 1,814,565 to 1,191,078 this week, for a 623K drop. Now that's pretty substantial, even for, you know, those that are big musicals that tend to fall. But 600 is pretty big. Normally you want to see a 2 or 3 or 4 in front of it. You don't want to go past 4. But regardless, it's not in any trouble. It's done amazing business the entire time it's been running on Broadway, and even though it had a lull this week, it's going to do amazing over Christmas. I suspect it might make $2 million, and if you look at before Thanksgiving, this week's numbers are very consistent, and that's key. Consistency and not having huge drops and huge falls, or huge like increases and then huge decreases. That can be very detrimental to a show. Gutenberg went from 94% to 88%, and $1 million last week to 974K this week, for a very small 121K drop, which is pretty good for Gutenberg, and for any musical coming off of a holiday high. Hadestown went from 98% to 94%, and 955K to 685K. Again, I don't know why they are still keeping this going. I think it should close in January. Obviously, it's not. I know that they are going to put in another pop star, but clearly Jordan Fisher isn't helping that much because it's doing the same business it was doing before Jordan Fisher came in. And again, I think that the only reason why Hadestown still exists is because of Limpica, or Lacage LaFox? No. And that's going to be at the Longacre, and that's going to be across the street from the Walter Kerr, and I can already see the op-ed in the New York Times, woman with 2 shows on Broadway. It's an optics move. It's very smart, but not for the business sake of Hadestown. So I don't see how this does not close next year, because it is clearly run out of steam. And it's the circle of life of musicals, you know. Musicals have great years and great momentum, and then they falter and patter off, and then the next show comes in. Hamilton went from 2,293,884 to 1,972,332 this week, for 100% capacity. Harmony did slightly better, going from 57% to 68%, and 522K to 649K. And again, Harmony is in trouble. It's in danger. It's definitely not doing good business-wise, but this is a step in the right direction. If it can manage to maintain 600K plus, it'll be fine. Even if it does 500,000, I think it can make it to the Tonys. But again, I don't think this is going to be a hit musical, as we can all tell. How to Dance in Ohio went from 72% to 71%, and 254K to 354K, and an average ticket of $62. This is in big trouble. The alarm bells are ringing heavily, and I don't think it's going to get good reviews from the New York Times. Audiences don't seem to like it. I'm hoping to see it before the end of the year, so I can give you my insight on why I think this isn't working. And there's actually a Twitter thread that the producer did, and some people were saying, you know, it should be doing better business because it's representation. Then someone else made a good point of, but the content of that is not good. And I think a lot of people, the consensus is that the content of How to Dance in Ohio is just not good. And unfortunately, it is the worst performing musical, I think, that's playing now. And not even Kimberly or Shucked went to these lows. So it is doing very poorly. And if it doesn't get raves from the New York Times, I suspect it will close in the next 2 months. It's in very real trouble. And the fact that it hasn't increased or gained any momentum is very concerning. I know people have criticized the marketing of it, and it is, and again, when you are a new musical that isn't good, that's all, and you're gonna be even at a worse than if you're a new musical that is good. Because Kimberly Akimbo, a new musical that's beloved, but even that is struggled to make a dent in the box office. Which kind of goes to the whole point of the sickness that is the movie musical adaptations taking over the culture of Broadway and allowing these new musicals to essentially falter out of existence. Kimberly Akimbo went from 80% to 78%, and 651K to 522K. Not a great week, and again, Kimberly Akimbo, an amazing musical, but it's not doing the business that it should. And it's very concerning for new musicals that are on Broadway. You know, I wonder, will this season's new batch of musicals like Limpica or Days of Wine and Roses, will that do better box office? You know, we still recovering from the pandemic. I think in a sense we are, but I think that audiences, again, are so conservative and tickets are so expensive, they want to know what they're going to see. And they're not going to know what they're going to go and see if they're seeing something like Kimberly Akimbo. Merrily went from 2 million last week to this week's 1,883,934 and 100% capacity. Moulin Rouge went from 99% to 99% and 1,384,588 last week to this week's 1,402,356. And again, very surprising that Moulin Rouge actually did better this week than last week, but very good. Shucked, and that's closing, went from 89% to 86%, and 862K to 822K, so it is ending on a very strong note. Six went from 1,174,410 to $1 million this week, and 98% to 93%. Some Like It Hot went from 76% to 75%, and 879K to 894K, and that, of course, is closing. Spamalot went from 90% to 75%, and 1,138,595 last week to this week's 823K, which, again, is a pretty sizable drop, but it could be worse. And, again, as long as Spamalot is making 800K plus a week, it's doing fine. It could even do the sevens, and it would be getting by just fine. And it's not the most expensive musical to do because it doesn't cost a lot. It's a lot of LED screens and stuff like that. So yes, it's costly, but it can survive not making $1 million to $900,000 a week. Sweeney went from 100% to 89%, and I believe that's because Josh Groban was out for a few performances this week, going from 2 million to 1,599,949, which again is an incredible number, and any show would kill for. But you know, when you think about how much Sweeney Todd needs to make a week, which is about 800,000. Or 850,000, but that's excluding royalties. It's probably costing at least $1 million a week to put on. So again, it's still overdoing it by tenfold, but you probably as a producer want to see 6s and 7s and 8s and 9s, but again, this is still an acceptable number. And those are the grosses for this week. Overall, I think everything did pretty well and held very well. However, I think Harmony, How to Dance in Ohio, and Hadestown and Akimbo are definitely in big trouble. And I do suspect that we will get closings for all of them next year. But let me know what you think in the comments. Like, subscribe, and comment. And I will see you in the next video. Peace.